A phone lights up on the table. The name on the screen is familiar. Someone you've known for years, maybe decades. You see it. You think about answering, and then you don't. A few minutes later, you tell yourself you'll call back tomorrow, but tomorrow comes and goes. Somehow, the call never happens. What's strange is that this isn't always about loneliness. In fact, many people over 50 still care deeply about their friends. They still enjoy a good conversation. They still smile when an old name appears on their phone. So why does something so simple start feeling harder? Late in the evening, the television plays quietly in the background. A coffee mug sits forgotten on the counter. The house isn't necessarily sad, just quieter than it used to be. And over time, certain habits begin to change. Plans get postponed. Messages wait a little longer. Weeks pass faster. Then one day, a friendship that once felt effortless seems to exist mostly in memories. Most people assume they know why this happens. They blame busy schedules, aging, distance. But those explanations don't tell the whole story. Because for many adults, the real shift begins long before friendships fade. It starts somewhere much less obvious, a place most people rarely think about. And once you notice it, a lot of other things begin to make sense. The strange thing is that this shift rarely announces itself. Most people don't wake up one morning and decide to become less social. It happens in smaller ways. A little more time spent alone. A few invitations declined. A phone call returned tomorrow instead of today. Then tomorrow becomes next week. And eventually, the delay starts feeling normal. For many people over 50, the issue isn't a lack of affection. It's something harder to see. By the end of a long day, there seems to be less room left over. Less energy for conversations, less patience for small talk, less enthusiasm for plans that once sounded easy. A person may sit in a comfortable chair after dinner, glance at a message from an old friend, and genuinely want to respond. They may even begin typing, then stop. Not because they don't care, because something inside them whispers, maybe later. That voice becomes familiar, and familiarity has a way of turning into habit. What's interesting is that many people blame themselves for this. They wonder if they're becoming unfriendly or distant or disconnected. But the reality is often much more human than that. Sometimes people are carrying things they barely notice themselves. Responsibilities, changes in routine, worries that never seem important enough to mention. Even small frustrations can quietly drain emotional energy over time. The result is subtle. A person still values friendship, still enjoys hearing from people, yet somehow reaching out begins to feel heavier than it once did. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the friendships still matter and the affection is still there, then what exactly changed? Because the answer may have less to do with personality and much more to do with the way life itself begins to shift after 50. The truth is, many friendships are built on routines we barely notice. The coworker you spoke with every morning, the neighbor you saw while walking the dog, the friend who always seemed to call at the right time. For years, those connections felt effortless, not because the relationships were effortless, but because life kept placing people in each other's path. Then life changes. Children grow up, careers end, people move, schedules become quieter, and something unexpected happens. The routines disappear before the friendships do. A man may retire and suddenly realize that half the conversations he once had every week happened by accident. A woman may spend more time caring for aging parents, grandchildren, or her own health, and slowly lose touch with people she genuinely misses. Nobody argues. Nobody has a falling out. The connection simply receives less attention than it used to. At first, that doesn't seem important. Months pass. Then a birthday is forgotten. A call feels slightly awkward. A text sits unanswered for a little too long. And now another question appears. Was the friendship fading? Or was the routine that supported it fading first? For many people over 50, that realization can be surprisingly emotional because it changes the story. It means they weren't becoming cold or selfish or uninterested. Life was changing around them, quietly. The difficult part is that these changes often happen so gradually that they feel normal, like furniture slowly shifting across a room. You don't notice it day to day, until one morning something feels different, and once people begin adapting to that quieter life, once evenings become more predictable and staying home becomes more comfortable, a new pattern often starts to take shape, one that can be much harder to recognize while it's happening. That new pattern rarely feels dangerous. In fact, that's part of what makes it so easy to miss. Staying home feels comfortable, predictable, safe. After a long day, the couch asks very little from you. The television doesn't expect a reply. The house doesn't require energy you aren't sure you have. And for a while, that comfort can feel like a reward. But something interesting happens when comfort becomes the default. The world outside begins to feel slightly farther away. Not overnight, just enough that making plans requires more thought than it used to. A friend suggests lunch. You consider it, then decide next week might be better. Next week arrives, and the answer is the same. Many people don't recognize this as isolation. They see it as protecting their peace. Sometimes it is, but sometimes something else is quietly happening. The less often we engage, the less natural engagement feels. A conversation that once required no effort suddenly feels like something that needs preparation. A simple phone call starts carrying a strange weight. Not because the friendship changed, because the habit changed. And habits shape more of our lives than we realize. You can see it in small moments. A message opened but unanswered. A birthday remembered but not acknowledged. A name that crosses your mind several times before you finally decide not to call. None of these moments seem important by themselves, yet together they create distance, the kind of distance that appears without arguments, without conflict, without anyone intending for it to happen. And that's where the story becomes more personal, because beneath the missed calls and postponed plans, there is often a deeper reason people rarely talk about. Not loneliness, not busyness, something much quieter, something tied to how people begin seeing themselves as the years move forward. And once that feeling takes hold, it can change far more than friendships. For many people, the hardest part isn't losing contact with friends. It's the story they begin telling themselves about why it happened. A missed call becomes two become 10. And after enough time passes, reaching out can feel strangely complicated. Not because the friendship disappeared, because embarrassment quietly moved into the space where comfort used to live. A person may sit at the kitchen table late at night, phone in hand, thinking about someone they haven't spoken to in months. Maybe longer. They wonder if it's been too much time. They wonder what they would even say. And then they put the phone down, not out of rejection, out of hesitation. That hesitation is rarely discussed, yet it may be one of the most powerful forces behind social withdrawal after 50, because what begins as distance can slowly become identity. Someone starts thinking, "I'm not as social as I used to be. I don't go out much anymore. I've become more of a homebody." The words seem harmless, but over time, people begin living inside those descriptions, and that's when the pattern becomes harder to see. The missed calls, the quieter evenings, the routines that slowly narrowed. None of them were really the cause. They were signs that something deeper was changing beneath the surface. Not friendship, not personality, self-perception, the way a person understands who they are now. And once that shift begins, another fear often appears, a private one, the fear that reconnecting might reveal how much life has changed, how much they have changed, because sometimes the distance from others isn't nearly as uncomfortable as confronting the distance from an earlier version of yourself. And that realization, that may be the reason so many people stop calling back. But it also points towards something surprisingly hopeful. Because if the problem isn't a lack of caring, then the solution may be very different from what most people imagine. Maybe that's the realization hiding underneath this entire story. Most people over 50 do not stop calling friends back because they stop caring. They stop because life changes, routines change, energy changes, confidence changes, and sometimes those changes happen so slowly that they become invisible. The missed call was never really the problem. Neither was the unanswered message. Those were simply the places where something deeper became visible. A person who once called without thinking now hesitates. A person who once said yes automatically now pauses. Not because friendship matters less, because life feels different than it once did. There is something strangely comforting about understanding that, because it replaces judgment with compassion. The friend who disappeared may not have wanted to disappear. The neighbor who stopped reaching out may not have lost interest. And, perhaps, neither did you. Sometimes people spend years believing they have become distant, when in reality they have simply been adapting to retirement, to loss, to changing health, to new responsibilities, to a version of life they never expected to be navigating. And adaptation can be exhausting, especially when no one talks about it. That's why so many people feel relieved when they finally recognize the pattern, not because it solves everything, but because it gives the experience a name. It transforms confusion into understanding. The phone call becomes more than a phone call. The silence becomes more than silence. The distance becomes something that can be seen, and once something can be seen, it no longer has to remain invisible. The most important truth may be this: connection rarely disappears all at once, which means it can often return the same way, quietly, gradually, one small step at a time. And that possibility changes everything, because now the story is no longer about why people drift apart. It's about what remains after all those years beneath the distance. Maybe that's why this subject touches so many people, not because it is about friendship, but because it is about something even more human. The desire to remain connected, to feel remembered, to know that, despite all the changes life brings, some parts of us are still able to reach another person. The morning after a long night looks different. Sunlight comes through the window, Coffee is poured. The house begins another ordinary day. From the outside, nothing has changed, and yet sometimes understanding changes everything, because there is a certain peace in realizing that distance is not always a measure of love. Silence is not always rejection, and a missed call is not always a sign that someone no longer cares. People carry entire seasons of life that nobody else can see. Responsibilities, losses, adjustments, private worries, small battles that never become conversations. Sometimes they simply become quieter, and so do the people carrying them. If you've recognized yourself anywhere in this story, perhaps the most important thing to remember is that human connection rarely disappears completely. It often waits, beneath routine, beneath hesitation, beneath the months that seem to slip by faster every year, waiting for a moment of courage or a moment of understanding. Sometimes both. And maybe, somewhere tonight, a phone will light up on a table. A familiar name will appear on the screen. For a few seconds, someone will hesitate, just as they always have. But this time, they may understand that feeling a little differently. And sometimes, understanding is where reconnection begins.